Welcome again, everyone, to the webinar on access to remedy and accessibility of grievance mechanisms. I'm Karen Vermeer, and I work as a policy officer at the Sociaal-Economic Council of the Netherlands, and we organize today's session. For those of you who do not know, the Sociaal-Economic Council is an advisory body in which companies, employees, and independent experts work together. We provide advisory support to the Dutch government and the Parliament on social and economic policy, and we have expertise on responsible business conduct through working on sector agreements. Through years of working with companies and stakeholders, we also build expertise on access to remedy, and we try to share this knowledge as much as possible. And this webinar is among other webinars we organize. So today we will focus on accessibility, one specific part of a grievance mechanism, and grievance mechanisms are, of course, a critical part of any due diligence, any company's due diligence process. Because they allow stakeholders to raise concerns and seek remedies for human rights and environmental impacts. But the thing is, they only work if they are truly accessible. And we see that companies often struggle with the accessibility part of a grievance mechanism. They struggle with this because of very common barriers that we see with many companies, such as language challenges, lack of awareness, fear of retaliation, or any technical limitations. So how can you as a company ensure that your grievance mechanism is truly accessible, inclusive, and effective? With that, effective. That's what we hope to dive in for the next 1.5 hours. And we are very happy to see so many of you here today. We're also very pleased to have both Vestas and OECD Watch as speakers to dive into this challenging topic, which brings me to the introduction of our speakers. First of all, we have my dear colleague Seljan Smeets. She is a senior policy officer at the Sociaal-Economic Council, and she will tell you more about international standards on grievance mechanisms and accessibility. We then have Hannah Greep. She's a policy officer, a policy and advocacy officer at OECD Watch, and she will share with us her perspective working for a civil society organization on accessibility. And last but not least, we have Bettina Thompson. She's a senior specialist and regional CSR manager at Vestas, and she will share with us her corporate experience on establishing and maintaining different grievance mechanisms. Each speaker will share their knowledge and insight with us for about 15 minutes each before we move into a joint Q&A of 20 minutes. You are more than welcome to pose your questions to the speakers during their presentation in the chat, and my colleagues will watch the chat to ensure that your questions will be asked during the Q&A. And before we move on to our speaker, we just briefly wanted to touch upon the UNGPs, the United Nations Guiding Principles in relation to grievance mechanisms. Just to set the scene, the UNGPs are a set of guidelines, as most of you know, for states and companies to prevent, address, and remedy human rights abuses committed by companies. They consist of 3 different pillars. First of all, a state's duty to protect human rights. The second pillar is the company's responsibility to respect human rights. And the last pillar is what we will talk about today, access to remedy for victims of business-related human rights. As part of their duty to protect, states must take appropriate steps to ensure that victims of human rights abuses are able to seek remedy. So this can be translated into, for instance, state-based grievance mechanisms. And for companies, the third pillar of remedy means that they should establish or participate in effective operational level grievance mechanisms for individuals and communities who may be adversely impacted. And the UNGPs listed 8 effectiveness criteria for grievance mechanisms, and accessibility is one of these criteria. I will stop here and move on to our first speaker, Selcan Veligieva-Smeets, and she will tell us more about the international standards on accessibility of grievance mechanisms. Selcan has been working with the Sociaal-Economic Council for about 3.5 years now, and she has been leading our Access to Remedy projects. She organized already several webinars on this topic, which can all be found on our website, and we'll make sure to share with you afterwards. Selcan, a warm welcome. To start with, could you maybe explain to us what accessibility is in relation to grievance mechanisms, and what are companies expected to do according to international standards on this specific item?
Thank you, Karen, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Happy to be in this webinar. Before I actually dive into accessibility, I want to take a minute just to reflect on the 8 effectiveness criteria. We did mention that UNGPs prescribe 8 effectiveness criteria, and accessibility is one of them. But I also want to emphasize that all these 8 effectiveness criteria are interrelated, and they are actually should be treated in a holistic manner, meaning that when you are designing your grievance mechanism, when you are assessing your grievance mechanism, you need to strive to meet all 8 criteria. And when you are actually failing to meet one criteria, it can have consequences to meet the rest. For instance, let's say your grievance mechanism is not trusted by stakeholder, meaning that the legitimacy criteria is not met. That will have effect on accessibility as well. So all of them are actually should be treated in a holistic manner. Having said that, accessibility is, I think, one of the criteria, what Karen also mentioned, is where the companies are struggling the most. So it would be really good to actually understand what accessibility means in practice. So UN guiding principles actually define accessibility from 2 aspects. The first aspect is what it's actually we can refer to as awareness raising. Accessible grievance mechanism is known to all stakeholder groups for whom it is designed. And it might seem as a very obvious thing, but we actually have seen a very few cases when concerns of right holders were escalated to bigger complaints when they didn't even know that there was a complaint mechanism within a company. So the first step is awareness raising, making sure that the stakeholders for whom you have designed your grievance mechanism actually know about its existence and know how to use it. And the second aspect to it is about actually understanding what barriers your stakeholders may face and designing your grievance mechanism in a way that grievance mechanism can address those concerns. And that aspect is more or less referred to as user friendliness of the grievance mechanism. And I will explain both of them in a bit. United Nations has Accountability and Remedy project, which have actually clarified both of them in a very detailed manner. So to begin with awareness raising. So what is expected from companies is actually they do proactive awareness raising and outreach. And this will, of course, depend on your company context. So who your stakeholders are, which countries you operate, what is the specific context of your supply chain, and etc. But important thing to emphasize that awareness raising should not be one-off event. It's not like one event where you inform your stakeholders that I have a grievance mechanism or information that you put online. Those standalone are not sufficient. So what we see, the most accessible complaint mechanism are where the companies are regularly, systematically use different methods to raise awareness. And what method we will use will, of course, depends on your context, but there are a combination of things that you can take. For instance, face-to-face engagements. For example, if your complaint mechanism is for your workers, regularly having those meetings with your workers and informing that this is the complaint mechanism and this is how to use it. Or, for example, if your stakeholders, target stakeholders are affected communities, having the meetings in town halls and explaining explaining them how the grievance mechanism works. That will be one way of doing it. Educational sessions, for instance, e-learning programs, or having the trainings, even making that as a part of onboarding process for new employees, so that they know from the beginning, like, how do I, to whom do I need to go if I have a complaint in this company? This could also be one way of raising awareness about your grievance mechanism. Then, of course, for example, preparing brochures, leaflets, or QR codes and putting them on prominent displayed places. This can be, for instance, canteens, this can be the public toilets, and this can be places where the stakeholders will not be intimidated, or will be freely able to actually scan the QR code or make the call easily. Sharing information both online but also offline, where you can, for example, give information about how this grievance mechanism works, and what complainants could do in order to lodge a complaint. And last but not least, it might be the case that the right holders will not be trusting the company. So enlisting help from civil society organization, or, for example, from the worker representatives, trade unions, even from the peers, like, for example, community members, when you are doing those outreach events, and that would also help you increase the awareness about your grievance mechanism with your stakeholders. So that's about awareness raising. And then the second aspect of accessibility is what we refer to as user-friendly approach. And before I actually dive into user-friendly approach, I want to make a side note here that in order to actually have those measures in place and be successful for user-friendly approach, companies need to are expected to do meaningful stakeholder dialogue and engagement, because user-friendly approach is about the barriers that your stakeholders might face. So without meaningful engagement, you will not be able to understand those barriers and address them. But in short, in practice, what does it mean? So to begin with, it starts with eligibility criteria when lodging complaints. Those eligibility criteria should be really clear and transparent and easy to follow. So complainants should not be requested to follow difficult steps in order to lodge complaint. And it should be clear for them, like, what is the process, what they need to do, what are the next steps. And those should also be in a non-discriminative manner and equally applied. So, for instance, the process should be the same for a permanent worker and a worker with flexible contract, or a worker with coming from a migrant background, and etc. So the complaints process should be applied in an equally and fair manner. Important aspect about it is communication channels. So the most successful complaint mechanism, the most accessible complaint mechanism, use a combination of formal and informal channels. For instance, there's online forms for receiving complaints, but there's also toll-free phone numbers. Depending on your context, maybe having a post box in the community places, or for example, if your target stakeholders are not really having access to internet, maybe having a person to whom the community members trust, to whom they can go and submit the complaints, can also work. So you really need to understand who your stakeholders are and build your complaint mechanism based on that. And for instance, if your stakeholders are mainly women, you also need to understand that, for example, the woman will not easily go to the male case managers when there's, for example, the case about sexual harassment. So understanding those and making your complaint mechanism designed to address those barriers. Of course, there's also other measures, for instance, not making a complaint mechanism too legal, for instance, not requesting complainants to define what human right is actually breached, because it might not be easily understandable for them what their human rights are and what is breached. So letting them actually explain it in their own terms and encouraging dialogue-based resolution. And in here, it's also important to be flexible with regards to the timeline, because it might take some time for victim to understand actually that there is an abuse, or when they do understand, they might not be aware that you have a complaint mechanism. So being flexible on that will also encourage them to use the grievance mechanism. And of course, also giving them the choice to represent themselves, or when it comes to that, using the third parties such as the trade unions, worker representatives, or others for their representation could also encourage them to apply to the complaint mechanism. There are also, of course, other measures you can take, and one of them is making it possible for complainants also using other alternative avenues. So complaint mechanism should never actually prevent a right holder from accessing other judicial or non-judicial grievance mechanisms. So they should be able to do that, and also in a parallel manner. Sometimes it could be the case that many stakeholders will have similar concern. For instance, if there is in a factory and the workers do not receive the salary, it should be possible for them to actually join their complaints and submit collaboratively one complaint and use one representative. So that will make the grievance mechanism also accessible. And another important aspect is regarding safe and inclusive access. That is, I think, really regarding the operation of the grievance mechanism. And I will explain it in more detail. For instance, think of your complaints mechanism. There's a complaint, and for the hearing of the case, you request the worker to come to a specific place. But when the worker comes, he will lose his daily wage. Or, for example, if it's a female employee, she might not have place to leave her child. So those are the examples when the stakeholders will think twice before lodging complaints, thinking that, okay, I don't have capacity actually to go through this complaint process because I will lose my wage, or I will not be able to go the process. So also thinking about those aspects will make the grievance mechanism more accessible to the stakeholders. Needless to say, there should not be a fee for lodging a complaint, and the financial cost associated with it should also be minimal. And I'll give an example to that as well. For instance, if you receive a complaint in your supply chain and you require a worker to travel to another city, for instance, and the worker will be incurring costs associated with it, he or she will not be readily inclined to lodge a complaint because of the financial costs. And last but not least, there's two aspects I think that's also important to note. One of them is that the most accessible grievance mechanism, they also make available resources and material, and sometimes also advisory support for the complainants. And think of it like, for example, instructional videos, how to lodge a complaint, what happens when you lodge a complaint, and those being in different languages depending on your stakeholders, but also in a very easy to follow language, so that, for example, illiterate people would also be able to follow them. And that the last measure is regarding confidentiality and ensuring safeguards from retaliation. So those are also important measures to keep in mind if you want your grievance mechanism to be accessible. So those are, in short, I think, the measures that I think prescribed by UN when it comes to the accessibility of grievance mechanism. I will stop there, Karen.
Thank you, Seljan. Very interesting to hear, especially talking about the two different elements of accessibility, awareness raising, and user-friendly approach, and then hearing all the different elements. I hope it's very helpful for the companies in the audience today for their own internal practices. You mentioned one of the last elements you mentioned in for the user-friendly part of accessibility was retaliation and this is something we often see as a barrier also that companies struggle with. Could you maybe share some more thoughts on this and explain also what you would companies advise to do to ensure that there is no retaliation?
Yes, of course. In order to actually explain what measures companies can take, I think we need to go back and understand a bit what retaliation actually means. Retaliation can take many different forms. It can be, for example, a physical threat, like if you lodge a complaint and you are kind of fearing that there might be physical harm to you. It can be economic retaliation, like you lodge a complaint, you fear that you will lose your job, or it can also take different forms. For instance, you will not be able to be promoted, or you will lose an important project that you are working. It can be social exclusion, like you lodge a complaint and your co-workers or your people around you will avoid you. It can also be legal retaliation, like you lodge a complaint and then there's a counter complaint lodged against you on a, for example, defamation or a completely different thing. And retaliation cannot always be easily seen. Sometimes it takes really subtle forms. And the people who are coming from marginalized backgrounds, they will be more at heightened risk for retaliation. Think of, for example, people who are living at poverty, they will be more fearing, for example, economic retaliation than others. And retaliation forms a psychological barrier. Like if you fear retaliation, you will not actually access the grievance mechanism. So when there is a fear of retaliation, the accessibility of grievance mechanism is compromised. So you actually want to have measures in place if you want your grievance mechanism to be accessible. And ensuring confidentiality and anonymity of complaints is an important measure, but standalone, that itself is not enough. Okay, we talked about retaliation. Now let's talk what measures you can take. I think the first thing actually what companies can do is to have zero tolerance stance on retaliation. And that should come from the top of the management, and it should be clear, crystal clear for everyone working at the company, for the supply chain, and etc. So you need to be really communicating it to all your stakeholders that we do not tolerate retaliation, and if retaliation happens, these are the consequences. That be really clear about it. The second thing is understand that retaliation is not only happening to the victim, it can also happen to other people. It can happen to for example, translators. It can happen to people working in the grievance mechanism. It can happen to the mediators, and also their family members. So you actually want, as a company, to train your personnel, especially those working in grievance mechanism, working in the human rights departments, HR departments, to actually understand how retaliation can work and what you can do, examples of retaliation and example measures, what you can do. So the personnel should be trained about it. Then before even complaint comes, you need to understand your stakeholders and kind of do a risk management. Where in my operations or in my company, employees or the stakeholders will face retaliation. So do the risk management in advance. And then also talk with the complainants when the complaints come into the company. So when a complaint comes, just check with the complainant. Do you fear retaliation? What are your options? What would you like from us? What is the remedy you want? And what is the safeguard measures that you would like to take? So have those conversations with them in advance. When it comes to the supply chain, it's also important to have those also in contracts. We see that companies already encourage their suppliers to have complaints mechanism, but it's also good in those contracts also have, or it could be also code of conducts, to have measures regarding retaliation, and also ensuring that there's a remedy when it comes to the business-related human rights cases. It also helps when the grievance mechanism is operated through third parties, like independent third channels, which can act as a buffer between the complainant and company. And of course, what we mentioned, confidentiality and anonymity, standalone is not enough, but it's also one of the measures that you can implement when you want safeguards from retaliation. And also, I think there are also certain other measures. For example, there are certain apps that you can use, which makes it anonymous from both sides, like from company side, but also from the complainant sides when they communicate with each other, reporting on an aggregated anonymous way about all the retaliation cases and what you have taken. So those are, I think, more or less the measures that that companies can take when it comes to retaliation.
Thank you, Seljan. Very, very interesting to hear, and also very practical solutions to retaliation. So thank you for your insightful presentation. I think it helps to have the international framework more clear, the theoretical part, to understand the different elements of accessibility. And we can now move on to the more practical implementation and the practical talks. If you have any questions to Seljan, however, please leave them in the chat and we will come back to them in the Q&A. Thank you, Seljan. If we now move on to our next speaker, she will share her perspective from working from a civil society organization, Hannah Greep. Hannah works with OECD Watch, and OECD Watch, for those of you who do not know, is a global civil society network with more than 140 members in over 50 countries. And the network is formally recognized as the representative of civil society to the OECD committee that promotes the OECD. And Hannah has been working with OECD Watch for 2 years now, and she helps manage the OECD Watch network through communications, capacity building, and advising on OECD complaints. So we're very happy to have you here today, Hannah. Welcome. We were wondering, as a CSO representative, what would you say are some of the most common barriers to accessibility that communities and stakeholders face when they are trying to file a grievance, when they're trying to file a complaint and use a grievance mechanism? And also, because there are so many companies here in the audience today, what would your suggestion be to overcome these barriers?
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you for inviting me here to speak at this webinar. It's really lovely to be here and to see so many folks in the room. As Karen said, I work at OECD Watch, and I do a lot of work looking at the national contact points that OECD governments who adhere to the OECD guidelines must set up. So any examples I give are usually related to NCPs. I think when it comes to accessibility, you have to remember that this is a very complex issue, and that means that barriers to accessibility can arise in various different ways. I think oftentimes accessibility is most often thought of at the moment of filing a complaint to a grievance mechanism, but it's also relevant sort of throughout that whole process and throughout the handling of any sort of complaint that's been lodged. What we see is that a number of issues associated with accessibility are often related back to the issue of some of the inherent power imbalances that we see between companies and complainants. So I think it's really important to remember that complainants are often individuals or communities that are not experts in how a grievance mechanism should function. Sometimes they are supported by sort of civil society organizations or NGOs, but more often than not, the people filing a complaint are very under-resourced. They don't have a huge amount of capacity. And, you know, they might be suffering from some of these adverse impacts day to day, which can have a really big impact on you as a person. And then if you sort of compare that to a company, often they will have both the internal and external sort of counsel around a complaint. And it's also important to remember that as a company, you have access to extensive documentation on your own activities, on the potential impacts that the company might be having, whereas a complainant often won't have access to all of that information. So you can see that there's sort of on an information level, there is that potential power imbalance. I think when it comes to how do you address this issue, you ask a good question, Karen, sort of what practically can companies do? I think there are some things, and this definitely echoes what Seljan was also talking about, that you can see sort of in the UNGPs as well. Barriers to participating, such as languages, such as location, or things around disclosure and transparency should all be addressed. And I think that's important to remember what Seljan said at the beginning, that all of the sort of core effectiveness criteria that are set out are all interlinked. So you'll see things like the transparency is linked to accessibility and other such things. So some of the things that we really look for is ensuring that key resources and documents, or even sort of meetings, dialogues that are happening, perhaps mediation that is happening, can be translated or interpreted into the language of the complainant. This means that they can more easily participate in that process then, if it is in the language that they're most comfortable speaking in. Sometimes it might mean that you actually have to conduct meetings with complainants in different locations. So sometimes we see sort of those meetings or dialogues happening either closer to where the impacts are felt, or sometimes actually further away if that's considered to be safer for the complainant, if they feel like that's going to give them more security. So that's another way that you can ensure different folks can actually participate. Obviously, we were just talking about sort of the risks of retaliation, which is a really, really important issue. And if complainants don't feel safe participating in the process in person, we do also see other ways of conducting mediation, such as through secure online platforms, or sometimes through a third-party representative if they have someone else who can represent them, which makes them feel more secure participating then in that process. It's also important to consider the intersectionality of the impacts, and also the way that might change how you engage with individuals and with communities. So there could be issues around gender and representation that should be addressed. And it really requires a company not to take things on face value, but to really start to assess the context and situation that they're operating in. So in some instances, we see that doing field research actually, particularly by people who are familiar with the local situation, can help support then the accessibility of the mechanism, because it can help you identify where problems might arise. It's very important that any of that type of research is done independently from the company, so that it gives that sort of impartial view of the situation on the ground. And it also means that potential complainants sort of have more trust in that as well. And then also, to echo what Seljan was saying, engaging with people on the ground, whether that be civil society representatives or whether that be workers or, you know, other potentially impacted communities, is hugely beneficial. And I'd actually just really like to emphasize this point that this should be viewed as a resource. The people who are on the ground sort of facing these impacts are also experts in what these impacts are, how they feel to them, and also the solutions to them. They often know what they want to be changed on the ground. So I would really encourage sort of changing. I think sometimes it's been seen as having to do a lot of the stakeholder engagement can be a burden, but actually to see it as really an opportunity to learn more and to be able to connect with folks on the ground. And then finally, just in terms of transparency, some of the key things are that all the relevant documents and arguments that are relevant to that grievance that has been raised should be shared between the parties. So what I was saying earlier about the company often has a lot more access to information about impacts, it's really important that, while you can protect sort of sensitive business information to an extent, all of the other relevant documents need to be shared with those complainants so that they're on the same level footing as the company in those dialogue meetings. And you can have good sort of confidentiality agreements outside of those dialogue meetings, but really inside you need that sharing so that the process can go along and you can address those power imbalances. It's also, which maybe doesn't always feel like it's connected to accessibility, but being transparent around what complaints have you received, how have you dealt with those complaints, and also like following up, maybe in a year's time, is that, are those impacts or are the outcomes from that complaint, still relevant? Are they still working, or does something else need to happen? Being really transparent about that, for instance, like having a database available to stakeholders, can increase the accessibility because it increases the trust that stakeholders will then have in that grievance mechanism, and also that understanding of what could that mechanism actually do for them, and is it worth them putting sort of their time and their resources into going through that process. So yeah, I think those are sort of some of the key things that I wanted to bring. I'll pass it back to you, Karen.
Well, thank you. It's very interesting to hear and learn about the barriers and also the solutions. I think that it's very helpful also for companies to understand that engaging with people on the ground can be a resource for your own due diligence process. We are, of course, also in this session today interested to hear not only about the barriers, but also about success stories. So do you have a couple of examples where grievance mechanisms were successful to meet the accessibility needs of affected communities? And are there any key lessons that companies can take away from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is really important, as you say, to also hear sort of the success stories as well. And like I said, I'm sort of drawing from examples of complaints that have been filed at national contact points, because that's what I work on the most. So for those of you who don't know, that is a voluntary mechanism for folks to use when they believe a company has violated the standards that are set out in the OECD guidelines. And actually, we see a number of examples from complaints that have been filed through these mechanisms where that mechanism has sort of gone above and beyond to ensure that it is accessible to complainants. So, for instance, we've seen cases in which they've done tandem mediation to protect the identity of the complainant. And basically what that means is that, if a complainant doesn't feel safe being in the same meeting as the company representative, the NCP has instead done separate meetings with the company and with the complainant, and then sort of relayed that information between. It sounds quite cumbersome, but actually we've seen cases where this has been really beneficial. It's allowed both the company and the complainant to really talk about, what are the issues and what are the solutions to those issues, while also maintaining that sort of safe environment for complainants who may fear retaliation, who may fear sort of what impacts could they be facing if either the company or if other folks know that they're going through this mechanism. And then I think we also see a lot of cases, I think particularly we've seen both at the NCP in the Netherlands, but also in Norway, that they've changed the location of mediation. So in a particular case, the Dutch NCP has set up mediation in the location where the impacts were felt, because also this is a particular thing with the NCPs. You know, a complaint can be filed to an NCP, say in the Netherlands, but the impacts could be felt, you know, in another country, which is quite far away. So to be able to get those complainants, say, to the Netherlands could be quite difficult. So rather they could set up mediation in the country where the impacts were felt. We know actually sort of a similar instance with the Norwegian NCP, where they actually paid for the travel costs of the complainants. So that's I think a really admirable sort of thing to do to ensure that that complainant can actually participate in the process. And they also, in one instance, in one particular case, actually paid for the group of complainants to have an advisor help them throughout the case. This was in a situation where the complainants really didn't have a lot of expertise, really were struggling with the whole sort of grievance mechanism process and, like, you know, participating in those meetings. So the Norwegian NCP actually paid for them to have an advisor who could help them understand what the process looks like, what are the standards set out and the guidelines, and how the company could be meeting them. And things like that to really help them still be able to participate even though they don't have the expertise. And then something that we do see a lot is paying for translation and interpretation. So there are a number of NCPs that actually commit to do this from the outset. They will look at, like, what are the key documents and can they get them translated into the language of complainants, and also how can they organize interpretation during those meetings. So this is something which I think you know, could be a low-hanging fruit almost to boost the accessibility of a mechanism. So those are just a few examples. There's also, if you are interested, OECD Watch actually keeps a complaints database of all NCP complaints that have been filed by civil society. And on there you can see a lot of information about, like, how that process went, and particularly how complainants view that process and how they feel about that process, which is difficult data to sort of consolidate, but you can read all about it on the complaints database to see some of those examples as well.
Thank you, Hannah. To close off, because we don't have much time before we move on to the next speaker, but I was really wondering from your perspective, what role do you think civil society organizations can play in helping companies to ensure that grievance mechanisms are truly accessible to affected or potentially affected stakeholders?
Yeah, absolutely. I think civil society play quite a unique role in helping impacted communities access the relevant grievance mechanisms, and crucially ensuring that they're pursuing a path that best suits their needs. As I'm sure many of you know, there's a whole variety of different grievance mechanisms out there. There's the operational level, there's the sort of headquarter level, there's multi-stakeholder initiatives, there's NCPs, there's UN mechanisms. So there's a lot of stuff out there which can be quite daunting to understand, you know, what mechanism suits their needs best, and what should they, you know, spend their time and resources on. So that's something that we do at OECD Watch. We really try to help civil society and impacted communities by providing advice on whether to file and also how to file complaints at national contact points. And then we also try to direct sort of communities or individuals to other mechanisms or to other experts on other mechanisms if we feel that that might be a better fit for them. We also provide advice to folks on how to file complaints strategically. So really thinking about how can it help them? You know, sometimes they might have a broader campaign. They might be facing a broad range of impacts and use a grievance mechanism to deal with one of those impacts. But you know, how does that help them with maybe some of the other impacts that they're facing? So yeah, like I say, we know that other civil society organizations provide similar advice for different types of mechanisms. And we try to encourage impacted communities or potentially impacted communities to really think about the broad array of things that could benefit them in that situation. Just one note to say from the side of companies, I think what's really helpful is what I was just saying around transparency. Just be as transparent as possible around the process and particularly around the outcomes. That can be really beneficial, both to the company itself. It can help you learn sort of, you know, maybe there are trends, maybe there are particular impacts that keep coming up and you need to change something in your operations. But it's also incredibly helpful for stakeholders to really understand, like, what does that process look like and what are the outcomes that they could get from that process. So that's something I would really encourage companies to be doing.
Thank you, Hannah, for your openness and sharing your insights with us. I think while you explained what CSOs can play for a role in ensuring that grievance mechanisms are more accessible, I also thought of a company that I've seen and that we at the Sociaal-Economic Council work with is by putting a list of civil society organizations who do exactly the work that OECD Watch is doing on their website next to their grievance mechanism, kind of as a resource that they can reach out to. So that's can also be very helpful for companies. If you have any questions, I already saw something in the chat, but if you have any specific questions to Hannah, please post them in the chat and we will come back to them during the Q&A. Thank you very much, Hannah. We will now move on to our last speaker, Bettina Thompson. To hear from a different perspective. She's working with a company and she works with Vestas, and Vestas is a global leader in sustainable energy solutions with a mission to transform the global energy system. And they design, manufacture, install and develop wind energy and hybrid projects. And Bettina has been working with Vestas for over 10 years, I believe, as a CSR senior specialist and the regional CSR manager of Europe, Middle East and Africa. Bettina, before I start, is there anything, could you maybe explain a little bit about Vestas and what you do?
Happy to do that, and thanks for the invitation. I've really been looking forward to have these discussions and engagement with the different parties here on this call here. But let me just quickly give you the bit of support here as well. So just to give a few more words on who Vestas is. So for those of you that might not know us. So as we are not you can say we're designing and manufacturing and installing and servicing wind energy projects across the globe. We have been more than 35,000 people today, and we are present in 88 countries. This of course, and out of those we have been pioneering our projects in 39 of these countries. We are, you can say, taking the lens of what it is that we are talking about today on the grievance mechanism, then such a wide footprint can, of course, also pose some challenges when it comes to implementing grievance mechanisms. And I hope in our discussions today and presentation here today that I can share some more insight on how our process is working and how it is that we're seeking to overcome some of the challenges that we of course have. But a little bit more on you said on Vestas' you can say our grievance mechanisms. We operate with two different set of grievance mechanisms. We have our ethics line. Our ethics line is our whistleblower system, and it's on a company-wide. It is available on our publicly on our website. It is you can say it's hosted by a secure platform. So it's a project that is, or our ethics line is a platform that address a lot of the code of conduct issues that we have. So issues that can relate to labor issues, environmental issues, anything to do with our supply chain, but also on affected communities. That is another right holder that we, of course, also work with. The other grievance mechanism we have is our operational grievance mechanism. That one is applied on our projects, so on our wind farm projects. And that, again, is, as you saw before, we have a presence in 88 countries. So that is quite a few countries to be operating in, and the level of implementation will differ based on how our role and responsibility on these projects are. It was also mentioned that in one of the earlier presentations that besides, of course, having our own grievance mechanism in place, we are also committing to work and collaborate throughout. Like if there is like a case for the OECD national contact points. We're happy to say that we have not had any cases in front of the national contact point, but should it come, of course, we are committed to collaborate with those, but we also, with the ombuds institutions or with any national courts, or if there's anything from a national human rights institution that reach out to us, then of course we are also collaborating with different parties. What is important to us is that we are listening to the local communities. And in this presentation here, I would really like to focus on the operational grievance mechanism, because again, that is in the downstream. Often we speak a lot about what is happening on more you can say on the ethics line, that reflects more into what it is that we're doing towards our own employees or workers in the supply chain. But maybe there is also a need to focus a little bit on what is happening downstream. So my focus will be a little bit on that one today. So we see the operational grievance mechanism as a quite important tool for us to build strong relations with our affected communities. We believe that this is a way for us to in a timely manner get any insights of any concerns or expectations from the affected communities where we have a wind farm project. It's important for us to get these timely information, because therethrough we can actually also reduce the risk to the project. It means that we can, you can say, before we can, if we get the concern, then we can address them before they turn into a grievance mechanism or into a grievance. When it turns into a grievance, it always can become both or impact both the relationship to our affected communities. It can also have an impact, of course, on any cost if there is a remedy that is needed to reflect on it, or it can have like in the end, if depending on how the engagement with the affected communities that have raised the case, then it can, of course, also have an impact on the social license to operate for us. So it's quite important to us to engage with the communities, understand what they're coming from, what their concerns or expectations are, and how it is that we together can seek to prevent it to happen, or so to react it on an issue in a timely way, so that we can also instead build stronger relationship, and through stronger relationship comes also trust. And I think that is something that is important to have in mind with whatever grievance mechanism we're speaking about, whether it's the ethics line that goes across the company, whether it's an operational level grievance mechanism that is more on the ground and together with the affected communities. And what it comes down to is whether people have trust in the system that you have, and that you believe that you're being listened to. The photo on the right here is actually a photo from our wind farm in the Lake Turkana wind power project in Kenya. And it's on purpose here that it is saying suggestion box and not a grievance box, because as we also addressed before, then language and the culture can differ from project to project, from country to country. So in this case here, like speaking about a grievance would in Kenya would not necessarily make sense. The word grievance, what does it actually mean? So instead, it was it was decided that a suggestion box is a more positive way also to ask communities to come forward and bring not just concerns but also expectations to us. So this was a way to meet the local communities in a sense where you could say that we have so that we get the engagement with the communities. This was a little bit about the two different grievance mechanisms we have.
Thank you, Bettina. That's very insightful and very interesting to hear also how you have two different types of grievance mechanisms, and also how for the operational level grievance mechanism, stakeholder engagement is crucial in order to make it effective and accessible. In Vesta's journey of designing and rolling out these two different sets of grievance mechanisms, I assume that this also came with some challenges internally or maybe externally. Could you tell the audience something about those, and also share how Vestas managed to overcome them?
Yeah, sure. I think that it's important to say that this is a journey, right? That I think that we developed our first grievance mechanism, operational grievance mechanism, back in 2013. And ever since, we have revisited our process, and to as long as like as we gain more experience, as we gain more insights from the expectations from our clients and from the customers, from the banks and others that are visiting our sites, then we also can develop our operational grievance mechanism. And I have shared this slide here, and bear over with me because I have tried to add in a few informations here, but you'll get the slides afterwards, and you can dive more into some of all these informations here. But what I wanted to share with you, and particularly on some of the challenges we see, is that is how is it that the roles and responsibilities across the parties on a wind farm is actually split. And some of the court cases or cases in the NCP that you might have seen or that Hannah knows about is often project or cases that has taken place or is based on how a project has been developed. And that means that it is often cases that links into our customer. And so it can be cases that links into land, how the land has been acquired for a wind farm project, how the people have been consulted during the development of the project, and in particular issues if there have been indigenous people, then how have they actually been involved, and how is it that they have, if there is a need to also have a free, prior and informed consent, how have that been approached? So that is a little bit like you can say down here, the blue line is the life of a project. So the first phase is where we are developing the project, and that can take everything from 2 to 10 years. So it's a long process, right? And a lot of issues can take place during the development of a project. A lot of expectations are being raised. People are moving into a site that were not there when expectations were agreed to, and that suddenly presents some new expectations. That is often where you can say the first cases with community engagement and concerns and grievances might take place. Then we win the project and investors move to the site. So that is then doing construction, you can say. That is then where investors instead will implement our operational level grievance mechanism. And that is where we will look into issues such as, do we have an impact with noise, dust, or waste pollution towards the communities? Is there anything on health, safety, or security of the community members? Do we impact on their livelihood with our activities? Is there anything, a risk that we can impact the cultural heritage or any customs? But also, how is it with the community expectations? Is there a balance of what they would like to see and then what we can actually meet from our end? So these are more, you can say, cases that falls in the scope of Vestas as a supplier of turbines on a site. So that's just to set up like what are the roles between the developer of a wind farm and then us as a supplier, and that I think is not always clear for everybody that there are different parties on a wind farm and that the issues can alert from different places. When it then comes to, you can say, what do we actually do to seek that our grievance mechanism is accessible for the community members? Well, I think that's one of the issues that are very important is that we are public, and that was also mentioned both by Seljan and Hannah, that we are public about our grievance mechanism. How is it that the communities can raise a concern or a grievance or raise any expectations to us? And again, as I showed before, we had a poster on a tree, but again, it could be a wind farm in a European context just as well as it can be a wind farm in a more in a country in more emerging markets where literacy and language skills can differ. Then we need to adapt the process that we have depending on the setting that we're setting up in. Our procedure is global, but we can adapt it to the different environment that we are operating in and the role that we have with the client. Another element that we use to improve access to our grievance mechanism is, and that depends then on the risk that we might have identified for this particular project. Is it a project that is located in an emerging market in the midst of a community with agriculture activities? Then often we will employ like a community liaison officer that is local. We will employ or ask our contractors to employ traffic marshals or flagmen that when we move in with heavy transport of our wind turbine equipment, then they will be available and along the road close to the community to indicate and raise the awareness about when we are coming, not to run after the trucks and so forward. So that's another way of making making ourselves accessible to the communities where they can contact us and raise any issues. It is often the community liaison officer that will receive any concerns or grievance towards us, but it could also be a focal point. So again, depending on the role, it might be a health and safety manager or an environmental manager or a security manager that acts as a focal point for us that could receive and register and make sure that the right persons are being involved in tackling any concerns or grievance. And then, of course, we are also making sure that the people on the projects from our end, but also the contractors are making aware about that we have this grievance mechanism and how they should, what is their role when they are being approached by community members, to receive it and to hand it into the right people. And we do that we have something called toolbox exercises, like 15 minutes every morning. So that is a mean that we can use. But also, it's important maybe to say, and also raised before, that affected communities can be anonymous, but that cannot stand alone, as also mentioned by Seljan. It is just one of the opportunities that you can have. But even though that we have these accessibilities and we try to implement that across, then of course we also have some challenges and some learnings that we have over the years. And one of the learnings that we have and that have really informed our how we are approaching our grievance mechanism today is that the communities, they see one project. So they don't see that there is a customer that has developed a project and us that might come in and supply the turbines, and then there are other contractors that are like civil works that construct the roads, and then the electrical operators that is in. So there are many parties on a project, right? So, but often we are, as a wind turbine supplier, we are often some of the first one that gets to the ground, and that means that we have the first engagement with the communities when it moves into construction. So we often see that in the beginning of a construction, we are faced with communities that reach out to us. They haven't heard about the project maybe, or they are unsure about what is what about their lands and so forward. And then we simply just are the middleman and try then to transfer the different requests to the right parties on a project. So to overcome that, we, during the development of the project and the negotiation, we align the roles and responsibilities with our customers on what it is, how do we see our role, and then up against what the clients should be doing. Another one that is also important, that learning, is that the distance from the village to the wind farm. Hannah was speaking into like the how can you get access or to a company or to a meeting. It's like, again, this is so important here. It might be that a community is living quite distant to where maybe the project has an office. Meaning that can be cost for traveling to the office to raise their concern, and one way to overcome that is then again that you strive to have different means of engaging with us. That can be a person on the ground, it can be a suggestion box, it can be, of course, the office, it can be the municipality, it can be a chief that locks, that has a logbook and locks it and then engage with us on a weekly basis. So there's just different means of how you can make sure that distance is not an issue. The imbalance was also mentioned before, and I think that's something that we see is that there is this imbalance with who is it actually that comes to the public meetings where we discuss the projects together with the different parties, often is men. So here, one way to overcome that we have seen working is that when we are employing a community liaison officer, then we both think about having a male and a female community liaison officer, so that the person can go out and engage with the women in their environment. So if we are in an emerging market, it can be where they pick up water. It can be where in the village where they may be on the markets or so forward. But trying to, in that sense, to meet the women where they are. And then on the last one here, anonymous concerns or complaints. Yes, it's while this is a benefit, of course, to the community member that you can be anonymous, it also comes with a little bit of a challenge, because if you are anonymous, it's more difficult for us to actually follow up on an issue and get more information maybe out of the person that have raised the case. So it's both, yes, good, but it also comes with a bit of a challenge. And we hope that when we are building trust over the time of the project life, then the community members that have an issue will feel more comfortable with approaching us and leave their contacts and so forward, so we can actually engage with them and get more insight, so we can approach it in the right way. This was a lot of information on the process and the roles and how we make it accessible, but also some of the challenges and learnings that we have had.
Well, thank you very much, Bettina. It's indeed a lot of information, and we'll make sure that participants will get the slides afterwards so they can read it at their own pace again. But it was very insightful to hear, and it's also, I want to thank you as well for your openness and about the things that you struggle with in terms of accessibility, because thus is very important that we learn from each other. I was especially, I think it might have especially been helpful to learn about the different roles different companies can play and what moment in the process you as a company come in, because that applies to different projects others than wind parks as well, of course. So this is something other companies in different sectors might come across as well. So thank you, Bettina, and I see that people found the chat. I hope it's still working. We changed something in the chat in the settings, so you should be able to post your questions now. If you have any specific questions to Bettina, please post them in the chat. We will now move on to our joint Q&A. And to start that off, to kickstart that, I see we already have several questions, so thank you, everyone. One of the first questions that was posted in the chat was by Daisy Banda, if I pronounce it correctly, from 2050. Her question is to Hannah, and her question is, Hannah, what platforms would you advise to manage grievance mechanisms that can be used for the wider community?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I think it's a good question, and I think it does sort of depend a little bit on the community and the context in which you're operating. So as we mentioned, doing meaningful stakeholder engagement, but also perhaps sort of field research by independent experts to help understand like the community a bit better, and what kind of intersectional impacts they might be sort of facing that you should be aware of. That can then have an impact on maybe the platform that you would decide to use to manage a grievance mechanism. So, I mean, one of the ways that we see a lot is simply just through a company website. They can have a database of grievances that have been lodged, including sort of key information, like what were the issues that were raised, what did the mechanism do in response, and were there any sort of concrete outcomes. And then you could try to make that as accessible as possible. So for instance, like using maybe QR codes in different places, or even just simply like sending sort of an email reminder to folks that this is available. However, then obviously in some situations, that's not going to be the most relevant platform. Maybe there's not access to the internet, or maybe it's just not simply very widely used within a community. So then sort of using the website might not be the best sort of platform. So in those instances, I think some of the things that Bettina mentioned, like having maybe like the suggestion box or something. You might also, if there's like a physical office, there could be a notice board that has that same information about the mechanism, but then it's in a different format. So that means that people are still aware of it and what it can do for them without having to sort of go online to access it. I think also like it's important to remember that stakeholder engagement is something that should happen throughout the whole operation. So it's not just sort of at the beginning to find out like what the context is, but it's also throughout. So you could also organize like events that are specifically about the fact that there's a grievance mechanism and about like what's happened and what the outcomes were, and that could then help like spread that message to a wider community. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but feel free to ask anything else.
Thank you very much, Hannah. We, of course, have some more questions. This one is to Bettina from Hada Windsor from CIC Denmark. And the question is, can you share any specific recommendations or examples of how companies can provide accessible communication and grievance channels for indigenous communities?
Well, I don't think that there is a need for having like specific grievance mechanism for indigenous people. It should work, I would say, through the operational grievance mechanism that you have. Like in the case of our grievance mechanism, it's one of the, you can say there can be issues there that can be raised. So it will be categorized and depending on what kind of issue it is that is being addressed, and then that will be taken into consideration. Indigenous people, yes, they do hold certain, you can say, rights, and these rights are in particular linked to the right to be consulted and to in the development of the projects and to land and that they are living off. And so yes, it will be issues like that, I would say, that can be addressed through the existing operational grievance mechanism.
Thank you, Bettina. We have some more questions for you in the chat, if that's all right.
Sure.
From GDE Coffee. These are two questions. First of all, how do you manage operational level grievance mechanisms in so many different countries? And I think related to that, how do you overcome the barriers raised by language and different cultures?
Oh, I think that so we do have like the way that we manage it is through our incident management system. So we have like a tool that is applied on all our projects where you can register health, safety, and environmental incidents. And in that system, we have also added a separate sections that is called community complaints. And so it means that staff on the projects, they have access to this tool and can register and managing the any grievances that comes that way. We will then on a quarterly basis we then monitor what is coming into the system and can then also react to if we can see that there are some topics that we need to take some actions on or learnings on from group level, you can say. But I think that it's important to, if you have a tool that is applied on a global level, that helps you.
Definitely. I was wondering if maybe Seljan or Hannah have something to add to this, or if not, I can move on to the next question. I see we can, I think, move on. This one is to you as well, Bettina, from Eneco. And the question is upstream supply chain, so the manufacturing of wind turbines, including the mining stages for raw materials, also developed within Vestas?
The ethics line, you can say, is rather, if it's more like upstream issues, then ethics line can be used for any issues that comes that way. That is rather than the operational agreements mechanism that is on the site where the wind farm is being produced. So, but otherwise, that would be through the ethics line that people can raise any issues.
Okay, and then our next question is to both Hannah and Bettina. It comes from European Energy. And the question is, do you have any best practice guidance specifically for grievance mechanisms for workers and communities in the supply chain? Maybe Hannah, you can go first, and then Bettina can catch your breath, and then Bettina can add if she has anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the question it was mentioned sort of the IFC guidance that's out there, which I would definitely recommend reviewing. I know that there's guidance from a lot of the sort of larger grievance mechanisms out there that show sort of some of the best practices. So from OECD Watch, we don't have specific guidance for grievance mechanisms for workers in supply chains, but what you can actually review on our website is we do have an assessment of national contact points, and in order to do that assessment we use key performance indicators, and they sort of cover how an NCP handles complaints, but also how they're set up and operate and how they promote that mechanism among stakeholders. So those indicators are actually based on best practices that we see across various different remedy mechanisms, and also based on some of the expectations and recommendations set out in the OECD guidelines as well. So what we've tried to do with those indicators is really address what are the needs and expectations of civil society for accessible and also effective grievance mechanisms. So while it's not sort of set out as a particular guidance, those could provide some guidance on the best practices. And then we've dived into a few specific issues that we see as very important. So for instance, we do have a handbook on how to engage with and ensure protection of human rights and environmental defenders. So that could also be a helpful guidance to take a look at on our website.
Thank you, Hannah. Bettina, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think that you covered it pretty well, Hannah. It's like there is, I guess it is when it comes to setting up the right format for a grievance mechanism. Then there is the UN guiding principles. It is and the OECD practices, the IFC and Equator principles that are out there and that can guide one in how to set up a grievance mechanism that match your context or your business, your size, and where you are operating in.
Great, thank you both. We have one more question to you, Bettina. This comes from the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and they are asking if you have any examples where local conflict resolution systems have been integrated into operational level grievance mechanisms.
Good question. No, not on top of my mind. I haven't any knowledge about like a local system that has been integrated into a operational grievance mechanism. I think it's rather that if it comes through and if you let's say you get a complaint, you would seek to address it with the party. You don't end with a joint understanding. Then it is rather that we as a company we can suggest other means or other ways for the complainant maybe to take the case to another party and test it there. I don't know. I hope, Gabby, that was that supported you.
Thank you. I think that was pretty clear. I see we have one more question, time for one more question before we have to close off. And I see we still have one open from Jan de Nul. And the question is to you as well, Bettina. And they are asking how you decide on the level of implementation of an operational level grievance mechanism.
The way that we decide at what level we should engage in comes with the role we have on the project. So if we are what is called an EPC contractor, so engineering, procurement, and construction, then we have then we are on the site from the day one, and that means often if we are in an emerging market with a high risk and a lot of people in either living on or off the wind farm, we would apply like a stronger setup than if we are supplying installation or supply only. Supplying installation means that we would lean more on what the client have set up of operational grievance mechanism, and then we report into their system. So there will be meetings, ongoing technical meetings, where any cases that is within our scope of responsibility will be addressed, and we'll be asked to handle them and then report into their system. So it of course also is you can say we prefer to implement our own system because, as it's been mentioned a few times, that we should be transparent on the agreements that we receive. If we report into a client's system, then we would have to do double work also to report it in our own system, allowing us to extract the grievances that we have been involved in on a global scale and to report on it on in our annual sustainability statements now. So yeah, it comes with a little bit of challenge now that we also have to be more and also wish to be more transparent on some of the grievances that we are involved in.
Thank you. And I see that the person asking the question answered already in the chat. That was very clear. So thank you, Bettina. I see we unfortunately have no more time for any questions. We are running out of time. But I wanted to thank you all for your sharp questions and thank you to the panel for answering them on the spot. So today we talked about the UNGPs and the third pillar of access to remedy and a company's grievance mechanism and how to make it more accessible because it's one of the key effectiveness criteria. Seljan briefly explains the two elements of accessibility. First of all, awareness raising, and then how to make it your grievance mechanism and the entire process user-friendly. We heard from Hannah about transparency, that it's key for companies, and it can also be very powerful for companies to gain trust externally, and how that it helps you to learn from your grievance mechanisms. And Bettina was very open about the struggles they had internally within Vestas, but also how they turned them around and have now two sets of different but very strong grievance mechanisms that are both open internally and externally. So to close off this webinar, we just wanted to mention that we hope it was very useful for you all and you learned something new today, and that you can take away the lessons from this webinar and help. That you can take them away and that they can help you review and improve your own grievance mechanisms. So thank you very much for joining, and a special thanks to the three speakers of today, Seljan, Hannah and Bettina, for sharing their knowledge and experience with everyone. We will share the recording with you in the coming weeks, and that leaves me with thanking you again and wishing you a great rest of the day.